Chairman, and thank you, Chair Powell, for being with us again today. I come from Colorado. I was in the legislature for 10 years, and when the pandemic happened, I was part of being one of the, unfortunately, elected people during that time, that difficult time. When I think about what our country was going through a few years ago, where our economy was almost in free fall, completely shut down. Our local governments were, they were slashing their budgets, they were laying people off, and what that moment meant that we had to do in stepping up at the national level to infuse dollars to save our country's economy. So my frustration here is that we continue to talk about inflation as if it was spending just to spend money, instead of acknowledging the urgent crisis that this country and this world was in, and what we needed to do in the moment to make sure that we were able to recover, keep our small businesses afloat, our local governments, and ultimately recover much more quickly than others. So since we talk about this often, I'd like to know, if you look to other countries around the world who didn't infuse dollars like we did, is there countries that we can look at to compare what the outcomes would be, and what is their recovery like now?
Our recovery is by far the strongest of any country. And I would say inflation that we have is actually, everybody has very high inflation. The EU, the United Kingdom, many countries within Europe as well.
Thank you. That was my next question, is how we compare to other highly developed economies on our recovery. So it sounds like in the emergency that we were in, the hopefully once in a century global pandemic, that the United States ultimately met the moment, and that when the American people look at what has been done, we should feel really good about where we are, but we know we have a long ways to go. And so I also want to acknowledge that something that comes up often is that rising debt leads to increase in higher rates of inflation. Doesn't that also include tax cuts, trillions of dollars of tax cuts that we couldn't afford that went on our rising debt?
In terms of today's inflation? So I think if you look, to your point, you look around the world, there's a common factor that has driven inflation very high in lots of advanced economies, and it's the pandemic, and it's everything about the pandemic: the closing of the economy, the reopening of the economy, the fiscal support, the monetary support, all the things that happened went into high inflation. And inflation is coming down. We'll look back on this, and we'll be able to look back at period of very high inflation. But I think it's not just monetary and fiscal policy; it's also just things to do with the pandemic, various shocks.
Absolutely. It's hard to believe where we were a few years ago and where we are now, although we do have challenges ahead. Another frustration that I have here is our failed policies around immigration reform and providing legal pathways for workers here in this country. When I talk to business leaders across the country, they say that the number one thing that we could do to address inflation is address legal pathways for people who want to work here. And so, while I recognize you say your job is to address inflation, you are still limited only within the tools that you have. So my question to you is, would an increased labor supply help supply chain issues and inflation in this country?
So we're seeing that now very much. A little bit to our surprise, we've seen a bounce back in labor force participation, and also a significant return to the prior trend in immigration. And that, we believe, and most analysts would say, that that's part of why employers are finding the labor market to be a little bit less tight now. It's still extremely tight, but that more labor supply is helping the labor market get back into balance, including through immigration.
Great, thank you. Another concern that I have is not just now our inability to address legal pathways to work in the United States and the consequences of not doing that to our economy. I really worry about in the long term if we don't address our labor shortage. So I'd like to know if we are unable to provide these pathways looking at the needs of this country, do you see this contributing to the rising costs and inflation here in the United States in the long term?
I'm not sure about the long term, but I would say that, you know, right now still employers are reporting a very significant excess of demand for workers over the supply of workers. And so there's a lot of demand out there for people to work.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ladies, time has expired.